All right, welcome to the Monday live stream for June 1st. Gonna go ahead and get going right away here. As you saw from the thumbnail, I want to talk about George Orwell a little bit and how I think Orwell relates to a lot of what is continuing to go on in society, even, at this point, I think we're looking at 70 some odd years since his death. So Orwell is still an informative and interesting person to follow. So with that in mind, who is George Orwell? Well, George Orwell was the pen name of Eric Arthur Blair, who was born to what would be an upper middle class family in Britain. Leaves at a relatively young age to go and be a colonial policeman in Burma. And that experience lays an undercurrent of a lot of how Orwell ends up looking at the world and what he does. He goes on and comes back to England. He goes and becomes a writer, and notably of both fiction and nonfiction, and a considerable amount of journalism. Some of the books that Orwell's known for are his novel Burmese Days, which is written about his time serving in Burma as a colonial policeman. He doesn't feature as a character in it per se, but it is about the time and the place and the occurrences. I think probably referring back to that time period in his life, one of his most brilliant essays is one that's called Shooting an Elephant, and it really gives a deep insight into the psychology of colonialism and the presence of colonialism, and it's a really worthwhile read. In addition to his fiction work, he also wrote quite a good deal of reportage, of book reviews, of literary analysis, and a really great book, I think, that really applicable at any point in time, but one that I personally consider to be one of Orwell's best is Homage to Catalonia. Orwell in the 30s went and fought alongside some of the anarchist internationalist brigades in the Spanish Civil War. And during that time period, he developed a very intense familiarity with both fascism in the form of Franco and his endeavors in Catalan, and in reference to Stalinism, because Orwell was fighting alongside a Trotskyist militia, and as a result became targeted by Stalin's NKVD and was almost arrested by them in his time in Spain. So I think Orwell has a lot going on there, and we see his attitudes manifest probably most explicitly in 1984, which, along with Animal Farm, are his two most famous books. I became acquainted with Orwell for the first time when I was in 8th grade. I think we had to read Animal Farm. And I'm going to be 100% honest, I thought it was a book about mean pigs. I didn't understand it at all. I didn't know why we were reading it. It made no sense to me in any way, shape, or form. And Orwell slipped off my radar. And then I was probably 19, maybe 20, when I read 1984 for the first time and absolutely fell in love with it. Loved the book. Loved everything about it. Read it a couple of times in the ensuing years, and then in my early 30s really started to plumb the depths of Orwell. And I've read a huge hunk of his essays, most of his books. Let me be 100% honest, I have not gotten through The Clergyman's Daughter. Some of Orwell's early fiction isn't that great. What do you want? Guy was learning how to do it. I don't know what to say. That said, Down and Out in Paris and London, absolutely phenomenal book. Road to Wigan Pier, phenomenal book. So where I think Orwell comes into my understanding in my life is at a time he becomes seminal for me at a time when I am starting to look at the world in a little bit broader way than I did as I was growing up South Side Chicago Irish. And as my worldview started to expand, as I traveled more, as I dealt with more and more people, I found more interest in what Orwell had to offer. And by the time I was in my mid-30s, had really plunged myself into reading a lot about Orwell, studying Orwell. I mean, multiple biographies. I have read most of his collected correspondence. I've spent some time with the dude, and one of the folks around Orwell, one of the people who writes about Orwell and is heavily influenced by Orwell that I've read a lot of as well, is Christopher Hitchens. And those of you who have read Hitchens will know that my title for this is a reference to Hitchens' 2002 book called Why Orwell Matters, which he then followed up on with an essay called Why Orwell Still Matters. He didn't use the parentheses, I did. So what Orwell brings to the table and what Orwell offers us are these ideas of being anti-authoritarian, of being anti-fascist, and most particularly, I think, the ideas of the importance of language and how language is used in the world. And that comes to us most explicitly out of an essay called Politics in the English Language. It's a short essay. If you don't want to invest hundreds of hours in reading all of Orwell's work, sit down, Google Politics in the English Language, and read it. There's a pretty good reading of it on YouTube as well. I don't remember who read it, but Google it, it's there. And or Bing, if that's your preferred search engine. But Politics in the English Language is a really interesting essay, and I think it's one that is particularly interesting in light of the climate that we live in right now. We talked a little bit last live stream 2 weeks ago about how people are in a very polarized ideological state, and that we tend to get very much mired in our political worldviews, and we don't so much have political worldviews as we are our political worldviews. That's something I'm going to... for those of you who do Boyd Book Club, there's going to be a lot about that in the upcoming semester. But for right now, what I want to focus on is this idea that Orwell starts speaking to in Politics in the English Language. And the first part of that essay is really focused on what Orwell sees as sort of the butchering of the English language. And for him, it's not that there should be a standard English used. In fact, he kind of takes umbrage at some of that. But what Orwell is looking at in the beginning of this essay is that language should not be used to obfuscate things. It should not be used haphazardly. That the words you use should have very tenable meaning. And that one of the problems that he sees is language being used in a way where meaning is unclear, where a writer communicating an idea leaves you wondering exactly what they're trying to say, what they're at. And he criticizes this. He wants language to be simple. He wants it to be direct. He wants every word to justify its existence on the page, and for the writer to cut out everything that he or she can to get to the heart of the matter. And this essay starts off seeming like, well, wait a minute, where's the politics in this? This is just a guy ranting about how he thinks writers are terrible. But the point that he gets to is this: those sloppy writing mistakes, those tendencies towards jargon, towards technical terminology, towards euphemism, take us in a direction where we are no longer speaking about the heart of a matter. And from Orwell's perspective, all language is political. all language is about communicating something about the human condition, and that is an act of politics. Orwell wants us to say things explicitly, clearly, directly. He doesn't want to hear the word collateral damage. He wants people to say civilian casualties. He doesn't want to hear winning hearts and minds. He wants you to just say pacification. And for Orwell, the danger of this euphemistic, jargonistic, hidden language is that it takes away the visceral reaction. It takes away the emotion, and it makes the action being discussed far too clinical. But it also can hide a lot of intention. And that's something that Orwell doesn't want. Orwell wants plain speaking to come out, particularly when it comes to these communications of import, of communications about our day-to-day lives and existences, communications about power, and about his themes of authoritarianism, fascism, Stalinistic communism, these sort of triad of things that he is so very much opposed to. So why is this your topic today, Chris? Well, I think we pretty well all are aware of the killing of the murder of George Floyd. And even I there was about to slip into a bit of hiding language, right? Killing as opposed to murder. One has a sort of a distancing to it, and I don't think we can distance from it. We have to call it what it is. Orwell wants us to call it what it is, so I'm going to call it what it is. And the protests that have come out of that have been rampant. Obviously, there has been a lot of media coverage of this because there has been a lot of violence around it. And that's the next thing that I want to talk a little bit about is violence, the language of violence, the language of protest, and the language of power. So the first reaction that I saw from President Trump about these the events that had occurred was his discussion, his speech after the SpaceX launch on Saturday. And I watched it very nervously and then went and saw the tweets that he had to offer up. And if you watched that speech on Saturday, you heard a reasonably measured response. If you've read the tweets, you know that he has advocated a much more violent approach in his language. You know, the United States of America will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. Vicious dogs, ominous weapons. This is the man's language that he uses when he is not on script. And if you watched his presentation Saturday, you would know that he was doing, for him, an incredible job of staying on teleprompter. He didn't go off script. I'm sure the folks who wrote his speech were very happy that he stayed focused. But that's not all he communicates. He communicates in a multitude of ways, and his language comes out in these various ways. What does this matter? How does this relate? Well, we all have to think about the language we use, the language we hear others use, and ask ourselves questions about that language. And right now, I think one of the biggest conversations that is happening nationwide, or should be happening, is the questions around what are the legitimate uses of violence. Violence is a tool. It is a tool that we use throughout social and international relations, right? Clausewitz said that war is just a continuation of politics, and violence is a tool that is used by individuals, by nation states, to exert power, to secure whatever their aims are, right? It is a continuum from negotiation through violence in the Clausewitzian sense, right? So as decision makers, as folks who are interested in thinking about decision making, we need to step back and think. We need to critically examine, what do we believe about violence and why do we believe it, right? I think right now there's a lot of confusion among people and a lot of very emotional responses to the violence that we are seeing, because there's a couple of different kinds of violence that have been on display in the last week. There is the state violence as carried out by police officers, right? In some cases, that violence has been within the boundaries of what is a reasonable use of force. We've seen that. It's completely reasonable. Then there has been the opposite extreme of the murder of Mr. Floyd, right? State violence, an agent of the state, acting in their capacity as an agent of the state, using violence that is beyond the pale. On the level of people who have been protesting, we have also seen a variety of forms of violence. We have seen violence in terms of the threat of violence. We have seen violence directed at agents of the state and property of the state. We have seen violence directed at private businesses. Those are three different kinds of violence. And we need to think about, where does it fit? What is acceptable? Because I'm willing to bet that each of us has a set of circumstances in which violence against any of those three kinds of violence from the non-state actor standpoint, right? So the threat of violence to carry forth your message, to show those in power what you believe, the act of violence against those in power, and the act of violence against a private citizen or business. I'm willing to bet that if you sit down for a few minutes, you can come up with a set of circumstances in which one or all three of those would be acceptable to you, right? It all depends on who's in power. It all depends on whose business it is. These things are circumstantial in that your circumstances matter. So with all of this going on, with all of this energy, with all of the vitriol that's being spilled, all the negativity, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I can't tell you what to think. What I'm going to encourage you to do is to take a step back and think about it. When do you think violence is justified? What are the conditions that justify it? And can you put yourself in a situation where you would use violence in some form? Tease that out. Think about that. Because a lot of where our ideas come from about violence right now, I think, are rooted in the notion that the state has a monopoly on violence, right? That idea first, really, I would say, comes to us in the form of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, which is the sort of the foundational text for a lot of Western political tradition, and much of what we consider social contract theory sort of pours forth from Hobbes' Leviathan. The actual assertion that the state has a monopoly on violence comes via Max Weber, who was a sociologist in the early 1900s, and he is really the first one who articulates that notion of states as being that which makes a state is the monopoly on violence. If you do not have a monopoly on violence in Weber's estimation, you aren't a state. You do not have the power of a state. So Weber is another one to think about, but I also think that we should look at this current criticism that's going on of Antifa, however you want to pronounce it. And a really good book for that is Mark Bray's Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And I think that if you read Leviathan, put it this way, you're going to have a much easier time reading Bray. All right? Hobbes is really interesting. It's a massive book and was written in the 1600s, so it's not exactly written in our vernacular. But you will get a really solid foundation in where the modern political system has its origins if you read Hobbes. However, I think that you could sit down and you could read Bray and you would get a very broad understanding of what anti-fascism is in its political philosophy. Right now, the president, along with a lot of folks, are throwing around the idea that Antifa is a group. If you actually spend any time reading anything about it, it's not. It's an anarchist viewpoint, so it doesn't have a hierarchy. There's no organizers. It's local. Yeah, read the book. But I think that if you want to call into question what your views on violence are, when it's acceptable, when it's not acceptable, regardless of your viewpoint, left or right, statist or anarchist, you should be reading rights. You should be reading Hobbes and Max Weber and Michael Walzer and Mark Bray. You should probably, and I'm not going to recommend you read Proudhon, but, he's good, but, not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. But think about these things. You don't have to sit down and read these books. I sat down and read these books, and I found them interesting. It doesn't mean you're going to find them interesting, but I think it helps to expose yourself to these other ideas and these other perspectives, and not just the perspective that you can digest in a TV news bit or an article in the heat of the moment. I think that you need to take a step back from these things and detach from what's actually happening in the moment and ask yourself questions about, why is it happening? How did we get here? Why do I feel the way I do about this? What's a circumstance where I would feel differently about it? And use those things to help inform your opinion, inform your language. Thinking back to what Orwell had to offer that I mentioned at the beginning, how do we strip away euphemism? How do we strip away jargon? How do we address what's really happening? One of the comments Orwell makes on politics in the English language is that both sides in Orwell's dichotomy, the extreme statist and the extreme anarchist, the fascist and the anarchist, can both use language to justify deplorable acts, to justify murder. That's true. The ability to manipulate language to hide what you're actually doing, what you're actually attempting to do, what your actual aims are, is not reserved to a particular political viewpoint. Even if that viewpoint is the one that you feel most comfortable wrapping up in. You don't need to do a damn thing. You can do whatever you want to do. I wish you would take the time to step back, think about these things, ask questions, ask why you believe what you believe, ask what that leads to. I think if we want to see society move in positive directions, that asking those questions is critical. So that's it for this week. Again, these are kind of off the cuff. I put together a little bit of an outline and pull some images in, but again, these aren't deeply researched videos. If you want the deeply researched issues and videos, then I would recommend you go ahead and jump in on our Patreon page. So patreon.com/ChrisFSW. That is how I produce all the deeper content. So for those of you who are coming to the Fire Service Warrior YouTube channel, maybe for the first time, you're going to see that on Thursdays, I've been posting what I call Boyd Book Club videos. The first semester of Boyd Book Club is something that I put together for patrons last year, and that launched going public a few weeks ago. Well, I guess about 10 weeks ago now. And the last 2 videos will go up this week and next week. I'm going to take a week or 2 and then roll out the second semester of that publicly. I'm in the process right now of launching semester 3 for patrons. So the syllabus for the current semester is live. The first video for this semester's work on Boyd Book Club will actually go live this Thursday. So June 4th, episode 1 of semester 3 will go up, and that's there. So if you're interested in this stuff, if you like the questioning, if you like looking at these ideas and you want to get a little bit more and delve into a few different perspectives and kind of dig apart some of the literature, that's what I'm doing with the Boyd Book Club stuff. And if you just like this, then any support that you can offer would be great. With that in mind, I would like to thank all of my patrons for their support, particularly Kevin Richson, Travis, Andrew Kehoe, Eddie Crombie, Chase Morgan, Adam Mayers, Ryan Trader, Justin Ide, James Brennan, John Kwan, Sonny O'Connor, David Hinosa, Eric Chisholm, Brock Clapp, Zach Riddle, Brandon Douglas, Timothy Bullard, Trevor Harderhorst, and Trey Knox. For everybody who supports the channel through Patreon, through buying books on Amazon, or from the adultacademy.org website, all of it, I appreciate it. Your support is what allows me to continue investing my time and energy into doing this work and creating this content. We'll see you soon. Cheers.